a seminar with Una Bergmane, a historian of political and international history. And Una is talking about her book, soon to be published by Oxford University Press, on relations between the US government, the Baltic independence movement, and Moscow during the perestroika years. And congrats, Una, on the nearing publishing date. Is it in February or March or something like that? That it's
sometime between February and March.
Okay, yes, yeah. So Una has previously worked or held positions at the LSE, at Yale and Cornell universities, and at the University of Helsinki political history units. And we had the pleasure of having Una at the Aleksanteri Institute as visiting fellow in 2018. And now she's back as Academy of Finland Research Fellow with her project titled Collective Memory and the Collapse of the USSR 1986-1991. And Una's talk will be followed by comments by Markku Kangaspuro, who's the director of the Aleksanteri Institute and working on both in political history and current day Russian developments. And as you see, we're now recording. We'll be recording Una's talk, but not the Q&A and comments session. Okay, Una, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Anna, and thank you for everything you've been doing for the Fellows program. I think it's a fantastic program. I'm very happy to talk about my book in this setting. And those 3 months in 2018 when I was here were very nice and very productive. And so I'm very happy to be here for a longer time now. So first, to explain what is this book about. Here you can see the cover of the book. That I'm very happy that it feels now much more real, the book, when I can see the cover. So there are two explanations of what this book is about, the simple one and the more elaborated one. And the simple one, which is actually very true, is that this is a book about the moment at the end of the Cold War, when the Baltic states said that we want to be independent, and Moscow said, no, 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 you can't. And the United States said, oh no, we have to deal with this, and why do we have to deal with this problem right now? A more elaborated way how to explain this would be to say that this is a book about how, at the time of this deep historical change that was perestroika and that was the end of the Cold War, how these deep historical changes disrupt the existing power structures, and this disruption of the power structures causes uncertainty. And the uncertainty then limits the agency of the big powers, such as the United States, such as the imperial power in the center in Moscow. And it does open windows of opportunity for those who are seen as marginal. If we look at the memoirs of the United States decision makers, if we look at not all, but most of the books that have been written about the end of the Cold War, the narrative about these events has been built around the agency of American power. If you look at most of the literature, not all, but huge part of it, literature about the collapse of the Soviet Union, these events have often been narrated focusing on Moscow or on the events in Russian Socialist Federative Republic. So, and there are, of course, good arguments for focusing on the superpower activities. Decisions that were made in Moscow or in Washington have to be studied because those who stand at the top of these power hierarchies, they have this unmatched capacity to shape historical processes. And the Russian role in the collapse of the Soviet Union is a crucial topic, not only because of Yeltsin's or Gorbachev's politics, but also because of the dominant position that Russians had in the Soviet Union. In this book, however, I have taken a different approach. I have decided to study the relations between those at the top of these international and domestic power hierarchies and those who were situated somewhere at the margins of these hierarchies. What I wanted to do with this approach was to avoid reproducing this imperial perspective, but I also didn't want to fall in a purely national perspective. I didn't want to write a book about, let's say, Latvian perspective on the Soviet collapse. I wanted to narrate the Estonian and Latvian and Lithuanian push for independence as this regional, transnational, and international endeavor, which was then embedded in these larger dynamics of perestroika, larger dynamics of the end of the Cold War, and larger dynamics of the demise of the Soviet Union. So how, every time I have to talk about the book, I feel that it's impossible because there are so many things. So today I will focus on one specific question, but which is rather important in the book. The question of what was the Baltic Question? What did the Baltic Question mean for American foreign policy? What did the Baltic Question mean for Gorbachev and perestroika? And what did this idea of Baltic independence mean for Baltic societies? To understand the Baltic Question during the Cold War, we of course have to go back to the 1939 and 1940. I think we all know the story. The Baltic countries were independent between 1918 and 1939. Well, 1940 to some extent. In 1939, we have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that was signed, and the Baltic countries were assigned to the Soviet zone of influence. In 1940, the Soviet Union occupied and then annexed Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. So what is important in this whole story about the Baltic quest for independence later in the late 80s is that at the time, in 1940, the United States, and then also most of European countries, refused to recognize this annexation of the Baltic countries by the Soviet Union as legal. So in a very similar way as today, the international community does not recognize the annexation of Crimea or other Ukrainian territories by Russia. The difference obviously was that in this case, in the Baltic case, these were the whole states that were annexed by the Soviet Union. So during the Cold War, the Baltic question was exactly this. The situation in which, in the eyes of the West, 3 republics out of 15, 3 Soviet republics out of 15 were not legally, in the eyes of the West, part of the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, this was a diplomatic tradition. It was this juridical construct, which had some impact on the lives, let's say, of Baltic refugees. It had some impact on what was possible for Western diplomacy in the Soviet Union. It wasn't possible. But generally, there was no meaningful impact on the foreign policy of the Western states. The non-recognition policy didn't have any major effect on the Cold War policies of the Western countries until the mid-late 80s, when on the one hand, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, and there was a huge improvement in the relations between the East and the West. And at the same time, we see this rather quick emergence of the Baltic independence movements. And this made the Western European countries and the US to face a dilemma which was very well described by Spanish diplomats. So Spain didn't have any major involvement with the Baltic independence movements, but in 1989, Spain was the president, it held the presidency of the European Economic Community. And so in this context, Spanish diplomats described this Western dilemma when it came to the Baltic countries. So they wrote, the Western world is faced with an obvious contradiction. Either lose this opportunity to support the Baltic states with a consequent breakdown of the principles held until today, non-recognition of absorption, or rather support openly the Baltic claims for independence, reducing Gorbachev's flexibility and creating new difficulties for perestroika. So this was the question for the international community, the question between a diplomatic tradition, the question, a choice between a diplomatic tradition, a principle of international law, and this practical need to cooperate for all the different reasons with this reformist leader of the Soviet Union, who has promised not only to change his own country, but also was willing to change the international system. For the White House, the situation was even more complicated and even more challenging, because in the United States, the Baltic question was not just a question of international relations and foreign policy, it was also a question of domestic politics. There was a 1 million strong, so rather small Baltic diaspora, but which at the same time was a rich and very well organized diaspora. Baltic diaspora had very good networks and very good contacts at the House of the Representatives and also in the Senate. And so between 1989 and 1991, not just the Baltic diaspora, but the United States Congress was constantly pushing Bush and even clashing with the president over the Baltic question and pushing Bush for a stronger stand on the Baltic issue. Bush himself was not opposed to the Baltic independence, but he was also a very careful president, unlike his son later, a very prudent president. And so the White House was trying to perform this highly challenging balancing act to affirm their full support for the reformer, Mikhail Gorbachev, while at the same time claiming that in principle, the Baltic states, not other Soviet republics, but the Baltic states should become independent. The whole situation was made even more complicated by the general uncertainty in the United States about how to deal with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. This unexpected rise of a reformist leader in the Soviet Union left the Americans, and I'm talking about the Bush administration, not about Reagan's administration, it left the White House in these uncharted waters because they were struggling to ascribe meaning to Gorbachev's actions, to untangle the complexity of Soviet power struggle. And so there were two key questions that preoccupied the White House. First, was Gorbachev a genuine leader, a genuine reformer? And would he be able to survive politically? Would his tenure actually last longer than these 4, 5, 3 years? The Baltic problem brought a third question to the table, and that question was, would Gorbachev use force in the Baltic countries to stop their drive for independence? And would that use of force mean the end of perestroika? And then, of course, if perestroika ended, what would then happen with all these negotiations, international negotiations, among which the German question was the most important one? So among these, the foreign policy of the United States regarding the Baltic question had one very consistent element, and that was the insistence that force should not be used in the Baltic countries. That was not a question about the use of force in other Soviet republics. That was a specific insistence that force should not be used in the Baltic countries. This issue was more important for Bush administration than the question of Baltic independence. Bush administration would have happily been able to live even without the Baltic independence. The real problem was to make sure that this crisis is diffused without Soviet use of force. This mattered not so much because of the Baltic nations, but it mattered because there was this fear in the White House that if Gorbachev decided to use force in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, it would complicate East-West relations at the time of German unification and other important negotiations, and then later also the Gulf War. So these dynamics once again reproduce this hierarchical approaches to national aspirations that often shape international relations. If we think about these international hierarchies, that at the top of these hierarchies of the questions at the end of the Cold War, German claims for unity were at the top of them. German claims for unity were perceived as legitimate, and the United States were ready to take risks and to actively back German claims for unity. Baltic claims for independence also were perceived as legitimate, but the United States were much more prudent in their support for Baltic independence. And then the independence claims for other Soviet republics were not perceived as legitimate, and they were not supported by the United States. So why was there a different attitude regarding the Baltic countries and other republics of the Soviet Union? We could say, well, first there was the non-recognition policy, but also Baltic geographical situation played in their favor. Unlike, for example, Azerbaijan or Georgia, they were not just a periphery of the Soviet Empire, they were the Western periphery. And so on the one hand, this enabled them to claim sameness with the West by affirming their Europeanness, and so improving their positions in these very often racialized hierarchies of national aspirations. On the other hand, because of their geographical situation, the active interest that Nordic countries and Poland took into the Baltic situation, also the interest that the Congress and diaspora took into the Baltic situation, it did increase Baltic visibility on the international agenda. So when it now comes to Mikhail Gorbachev and the Baltic question, we see a very similar problem of uncertainty. If we can talk about the general American uncertainty of how to deal with the collapse of the Soviet Union, then when it comes to Gorbachev, we see a very deep uncertainty, not just his own personal, but among Soviet elites at the time, of how to deal with regarding the question of relations between the center and the periphery in general, and the Baltic question in particular. So Gorbachev's very ambitious reforms, and we talk often about his economic reforms as a failure, but we don't talk, I think, enough about his political reforms as a success. The democratization of the Soviet Union was actually a very successful process. But all of this also pushed the Soviet society in this unknown territory, making uncertainty this an everyday experience of all Soviet citizens. So Mikhail Gorbachev and his advisors, they had a vision of this new reformed Soviet Union, but they did not have a clear plan of how to handle the economic and social forces that were unleashed by his reforms. And I think what is very important to emphasize it is all the routines and practices of the center-periphery relations in the Soviet Union were established for an authoritarian framework. And they were shaped according to this imperial paradigm in which Moscow had the final say upon the republic's affairs. But when the effect of perestroika really came, the democratizing effect of perestroika completely changed these dynamics. Because starting from 1988, 1989, the central power in Moscow had to face something it had not seen before, this increasingly pluralistic and democratic periphery. And so at this moment, Gorbachev and his closest entourage didn't really have a plan on how to deal with this. So the story of Gorbachev's relations with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia is not just a story about the relations between Soviet center and periphery, but it's also a story about this deep tension at the heart of perestroika project. So a tension between democratization of Soviet society and the preservation of the Soviet Empire. That was the Baltic question, whether to go to the end in this logic of democratization and accept the will of the people, such as it was expressed in democratic elections or in the independence referendums, whether to accept it and let the Baltic states become independent, or to do what was necessary, including the use of force, to preserve the Soviet Empire. Gorbachev's liberal advisors, such as Chernayev, such as Yakovlev, they were strongly opposed to the use of force, and they were first proposed to Gorbachev considerable autonomy for the Baltic countries and then even independence, arguing that the Baltic countries could become independent while the rest of the Soviet Union could still function as some sort of federal state. That was also the understanding of Boris Yeltsin. He was not looking for disintegration of the Soviet Union, but he was very early, already around 1989, willing to accept the independence of the Baltic countries. That was the view of Gorbachev's closest advisors and Boris Yeltsin as his main rival. That was not the view of Gorbachev himself, and that was not the view of Soviet conservatives from the KGB, from the conservative parts of the Communist Party, from the Ministry of Defense. The conservative forces very quickly came into the idea that force was the only answer to Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian push for independence. So Gorbachev was caught between these two views. He hesitated and procrastinated in terms of taking a decision what to do with the Baltic situation. As you probably know, in January 1991, there was an attempt which was supported by Gorbachev. There was an attempt by the conservative forces to use force in the Baltic countries. But when Gorbachev saw the outrage that this use of force in Vilnius and then in Riga provoked, not only internationally, but also domestically, he very quickly backtracked from this idea that force could be an option for the Baltic problem. And he came back to basically not knowing what to do with the Baltic situation until the August coup came. So finally, and that's my third part, the Baltic countries and the reasons for this push for independence. Historians outside the Baltic states have sometimes, and even in the recent scholarship, limited explanation of Baltic independence to the Baltic nationalism. And that obviously is not the wrong answer. The claim for independence was a nationalist claim, as independence claims are in most of the cases. But what is interesting that not very often it is understood that this nationalism was a response to certain realities of life under the Soviet rule. Even in very recent scholarship, I have seen this idea that Baltic push for independence was somehow irrational, because after all, for the Baltic countries, maybe not for the others, but for the Baltic countries, life was not that bad in the Soviet Union. This is very interesting because this is, on one hand, this idea of ungrateful imperial subject who is irrational and doesn't understand what's best for them. But also, this is something that Gorbachev really struggled to understand, why the Baltic countries would want to become independent. And this misperception was due to the image that Baltic republics had in the Soviet collective imagination. So the collective imaginary in the Soviet Union was shaped by ethno-linguistic, racial, economic, and spatial hierarchies. So, for example, to explain this imperial domination over, for example, Central Asian republics was justified through the narratives of backwardness and modernization. Meanwhile, the Baltic countries were perceived as the civilized and advanced region of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet rule was legitimized through the narrative of liberation and Soviet victory in the Second World War. So for a very long time, these three countries were used as a showcase of Soviet success, and Gorbachev hoped that they would also become the testing ground of economic reforms, which they were very willing to do. So to some extent, Gorbachev was blinded by this imagined success story of the Baltic region in the Soviet Union, and he deeply misperceived the actual mood in the Baltic countries. these societies, which from the outside looked very calm because there were no ethnic violence, they were comparatively rich in the Soviet context. So they looked very different from the outside, but in the reality, these societies were deeply troubled by both the memories of Stalin's repressions, experience of the Soviet repressive version of modernity, especially the Russifying effects of the Soviet modernity, the contradiction of nationality policies, and the environmental concerns. So these were factors that had an impact on the lives of all Soviet citizens. The question is why in the Baltic case, they produced this rather rapid push for independence, in the sense that the Baltic countries were the first ones to claim larger autonomy, economic autonomy, political autonomy. They were first ones to claim independence, to proclaim independence. They were the ones who had the most active outreach internationally. So the specificity of the Baltic case, so the specificity of the Baltic case came from their history and their geographical position. Their history and their geographical position made them aware of the possible alternatives to the Soviet life. So there was a living memory of statehood, there was a living memory of independence, there was, to some, even limited experience of democracy in the interwar period. And then, of course, because of the Baltic geography, there was the exposure of, on one hand, the revolutionary dynamics of Eastern Europe in 1989, and then also to the Nordic and German influences. So what I try to show in the book is that the fact that the larger majority of people living in the Baltic countries did rally around the independence project in the 1990 elections or in the referendums that took place in 1991, this rallying around the independence project was a result of internal cohesion. The idea of independence as the only solution of all the problems did not appear suddenly in 85 and would be suddenly immediately accepted by everybody. There were the Russian-speaking minorities. There was the communist establishment in the Baltic countries. There was just parts of society that were not involved in politics. So this rallying around the independence project was also, not exclusively, but to a large extent, accelerated by Moscow's unwillingness or inability to meaningfully respond to the Baltic grievances about very specific things that dissatisfied them in this life in the Soviet Union. The most burning issue in Estonian-Latvian case and Latvian-Estonian case was a specific case. It can be compared only to what happened in Kazakhstan in terms of the large influx of migrants from other Soviet republics. So the migration as such was not the main issue, because Baltic societies historically have been multicultural societies. The problem was the scope of migration. By the end of the Soviet period, Latvians had almost become an ethnic minority in Latvia, and Estonian situation was going to that direction. So the scope was one problem. The other problem was that the migration flows were in the Soviet Union were managed by the state. And so there was constantly this question in Estonian Latvian societies, why are these decisions made regarding the scope of the migration? And finally, the whole Soviet system made the situation rather challenging, because migrants, and they mostly were people who came either from Russia or in some cases from Belarus or Ukraine, they were not encouraged by the Soviet system to learn the local languages or to somehow embrace the local societies and to become part of these societies. They were rather encouraged by the Soviet system, by the nationality policies, to not only to claim certain privileges that Russian speakers had in the Soviet Union, but also to some extent isolate themselves from these local societies. And Moscow's unwillingness to take Estonian Latvian grievances regarding the situation seriously was one, and not the only one, but one of the major accelerators in the emergence of this idea that independence is the only solution to all the problems. So how did this independence idea take hold of the Baltic societies? We have to think about this, I think, in terms of increased ontological insecurity. So emergence of this collective, socially constructed and subjective, but at the same time, real fear about the future of these collective selves defined as Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian nations. So this idea that for the Baltic nations to have a substantial future, they have to cut this imperial ties with Moscow. So by consequence, in the late 80s and early 90s, Baltic activists and governments, pro-independence governments, they saw themselves as being engaged in these, as my Estonian colleague Karel Pirma has written, in these existential politics, struggling for independence as a precondition of meaningful national futures. And this, again, is very interesting when we think about this very active Baltic outreach to international communities. Yeah, I was late with the last slide. So this is the slide about the Baltic countries. So in the context of these existential anxieties, Baltic active outreach to international community had a special meaning. In this context, these international communities functioned as this significant other that has to test and testify your existence. So what Baltic independence activists sought was not just legal, but also existential recognition and affirmation. What they wanted, they wanted to be perceived as a European nations. They wanted to underline their specificity in the Soviet context, and they argued that their independence claims are as legitimate as the German calls for unity. And so the book tells about the strategies and that the Baltic governments, but also the diaspora activists used to make sure that to increase the visibility of the Baltic question on the international agenda. So in conclusion, why and how did the Baltic states obtain the independence? Long story short, so now I'm really jumping to the last chapter of the book. One could say that the Baltic states became independent because of the August coup. After the August coup, first Yeltsin and then international community, and finally also Mikhail Gorbachev recognized the independence of the Baltic states. There is, however, an important nuance in this story. All these actors, Yeltsin, international community, and Gorbachev, recognized the Baltic countries in late August or early September 1991, while at the same time hoping, and that was the hope in Washington and in Moscow, that Baltic states could become independent, while the rest of the Soviet Union would find some sort of an arrangement and to continue to function as some sort of reformed federation. And this, I think, this idea that the Baltic countries are somehow different from the rest of the Soviet Union, and the existence of Soviet and post-Soviet empire does not require the presence of the Baltic states, this idea had long-term consequences, in my view. When we ask, and that is a question which is often asked, why the Baltic states were able to become members of NATO without Russia starting major wars, or members of the European Union, and why the Western world was also willing to consider and then allow the Baltic countries to join the EU and NATO, then part of the answer, and I want to underline million times part of the answer. This is not the whole answer, but part of the answer is that the place that the Baltic countries had both in Western and Russian collective imaginary. This idea that emerged in the late 80s, or probably even earlier in the Soviet period during the Cold War, that the Baltic countries are not really entirely part of the Soviet world or the post-Soviet space. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk about the book for such a long time, as 35 minutes or something like that.